All right, today I'm going to talk about chapter 24 from your Shillington book. Now, chapter 24 is called Africa Between the Wars, the High Tide of Colonial Rule. Uh, basically, you could say this is the time from about 1918 to 1939, 1940. By this time, all but the most isolated parts of Africa were under colonial control. And more importantly, uh, Africa's economy had been converted. Now, Africa had been part of the world economy. Sub-Saharan Africa had been a major part of the world economy for several hundred years. Of course, the most dramatic example of this was the slave trade, in which millions of Africans were purchased and brought to the Americas in particular, and were used to develop plantation agriculture. Now also there was a slave trade in the Indian Ocean too. But the largest and most intense slave trade was the transatlantic slave trade. Now, as we mentioned earlier, as the slave trade waned, you had the development of what became known as legitimate trade. This was primarily in West Africa, focused around vegetable oils, in the Senegal area, in which what the French refer to as the Sudan, or what we might refer to as the Sahel. It revolved around groundnut or peanut oil, or peanuts, which could be ground and used in oil. The oil could be used for industrial purposes, and also the oil could be used as the foundation of soap manufacturing. Both of those were major items. Now, a little bit further to the south and closer to the coast, in the Niger Delta region, and a few other areas in coastal West Africa, palm oil was the major ingredient that was used. To this day, if you look at the company Palm Olive, the name Palm Olive itself, refers to palm and olive oil, which were two of the major vegetable oils that were used in soap production. And so, therefore, Africa had been integrated into the world economy for a long time. But what we see with the development of colonialism is that Europeans captured or gained control of gained total control of the African economy. Prior to colonialism, Africans did have some agency over how they interacted with the world economy. If they didn't get the prices they want, they didn't necessarily have to sell something. They were able to make some demands. And also, this is a very important thing too. Africans who were not interested in international trade did not have to participate in international trade. And Africans did not necessarily have to be dependent on a monetary economy. There was money in Africa. There was foreign money that came in, and also there were traditional forms of currency, like, for instance, the cowrie shells, which were shells that originally came from the Indian Ocean area that could be put on strings and that were used as money in West Africa in particular. So there were forms of money. But by and large, people did not need money for their day-to-day life. Now, actually, this was not something that was unique to Africa. If you look at America at the same time in the 19th century, many pioneers did not use money that often. Money was something that, if you were a farmer or if you were a trapper or somebody of that nature, you might not use money that much. If you had a farm, you grew your own food, you could hunt, you could trade things. You didn't necessarily have to have money that much. And so the fact that Africans weren't not necessarily plugged into a monetary economy does not mean that they were primitive. As I said before, there were many parts of the world with people of European extraction who weren't that tightly plugged into the monetary economy either. And so, really, I think it's important to understand that the expansion of colonialism, you can't see it separately, and it's really integral to the expansion of capitalism. Because by the time you get to the 20th century, people all over the world, whether you're talking about farmers in rural villages in America, or you're talking about uh, people who lived in small villages uh, in equatorial Africa. All these people found themselves being pushed into a money economy, needing to have jobs. Now, one of the major ways this happened that the book mentions was through head taxes. I mean, this is basically you pay tax for having a head. This is something that men were subjected to, and as Shillington mentions, the whole idea behind this was to force people to take jobs and work in order to pay the tax. I mean, if you had to, the tax itself is not a big tax. Like he mentioned, for instance, in many of the British colonies, it amounted to about £1, which, in today's money would probably be about $5 or $6. Which even then, depending on what kind of job you had, was not that much money. But for people who had not been in monetized economies before, this meant that they had to get jobs that paid money in order to pay this tax. Because these taxes specifically in many of these colonies were not allowed. They could not pay the taxes in kind. Because in the past, if you were a farmer, if you grew rubber, if you tapped rubber, if you grew cotton, if you got palm oil or peanuts or whatever, or ground nuts as they say in Africa, you could bring in these commodities and they would serve for a tax. But in order to force people to work, you had to pay in cash. And so this was something to bring people into the market. Now, the interesting thing, however, is that as Shillington mentions, plantation economies did not necessarily always dominate. He gave the example, for instance, of the Gold Coast, modern day Ghana, where a cacao, the raw material for chocolate, was the major export crop. And there were attempts to establish foreign controlled plantations, but local farmers were able to maintain control of the crops, and so therefore it stayed in their hands. Now, in other areas, like for instance in equatorial Africa, in the Congo, Congo Brazzaville, Gabon, some of these other territories that did not have as long of a history of interaction with the world market as the Gold Coast, or say the Niger Delta in what nowadays is Nigeria. People trying to establish, Europeans trying to establish plantations had more success, because the people there, especially like in what nowadays the Democratic Republic of Congo, many of these people have been quite isolated, but all of a sudden, in the latter middle part of the 19th century, they were violently forced into production of things like rubber in order to satisfy the demands of the Congo Free State, which controlled them. And so therefore it was easier to force people to go to work in plantations under these circumstances. Also in places like Kenya, especially in the Kenyan highlands, where the weather was very, very good, and it was an area that was designated for European settlement. Europeans came into those areas and forcibly took over areas, and forced local people like the Kikuyu in particular, forced them off the land and forced them to work for them. So, in particular circumstances, Europeans came in and directly forced Africans off the land and forced them to work for them. In most situations, however, Africans, stayed a majority, and they supplied the material that colonists wanted. Now, there were exceptions to this. Like, for instance, they mentioned Liberia, which had been founded by African American former slaves with the help of American slave owners who really wanted to send free blacks back to Africa so They wouldn't give ideas to Americans who were black Americans who were still enslaved. Uh, Liberia, found itself as the one country in West Africa that effectively had a black government, and so therefore the Firestone Company, the big rubber company, uh, they ended up dealing directly with the Liberian government in order to get the labor they needed in order to produce the rubber they wanted for their tire manufacturing. And so we see it, and we see that working there. Now, the other thing that Shillington brings up that I think is very significant is the role of education in Africa. And he mentions, for instance, in those areas that were dominated by Islam, uh, education was left in the hands of Islamic teachers. People uh, went to Islamic schools and learned there. They learned to read the Quran, or pretty much learn how to recite the Quran. Those who got better at it, had a stronger understanding of Arabic. I mean, it's and were able to read with deeper comprehension. Uh, and so basically, this education, which was focused on boys, primarily gave young people basically religious education. Those people who got better educated were able to deal deeper in religious laws and religious matters, and also learned, schools of legal interpretation that were based on the Sharia in the Quran. Now, this traditional education was adequate for local rulers who during this time, emerged as the arm of the colonial state in Islamic areas. I mean, in places like northern Nigeria, places like northern Sudan, places like the Swahili coast of Kenya, or in places like Zanzibar. Uh, these Muslim leaders were basically the interlocutors between the colonial state and the between the colonial state and the local rulers. They were the people who collected taxes. They were the people who settled minor legal claims. They were in charge of issues like marriage or inheritance. They took care of that. Now, in areas where Islam was not so strong, uh, for the early period, the greatest source of education was missionary schools. And these folks, they focused on religion, but they also uh, taught people in Western languages. I mean, particularly in British areas, they were teaching English. Uh, in French areas, they taught French. Now, the missionary movement was much stronger in English-speaking areas, and in particular, it was very old in certain parts of Africa. Like, for instance, in South Africa, the CMS, a Church Missionary Society, and also some German missionary societies, had established missions. Very early in the 19th century, they had established missions there. And they had established very, very strong systems of education. If you all notice in that earlier chapter I talked about, they talked about nationalism. They talked about, back in the 1860s, about you had people who worked as doctors and other folks who had gotten education that started in missions. Now, this process continued in the interwar period. However, as Shillington mentions, what we see is that as you had more people getting Western education, they began to seek higher levels of education. Now, with the exception of South Africa, which had a black college that was based on the what we nowadays call HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities in the United States. The great majority of the Africans who wanted better education, they found themselves going to schools in North America. Like, for instance, Shillington gave the example of Nnamdi Ezekwe, Nnamdi Ezekwe, who got his education at Lincoln University, and also Kwame Nkrumah, who went to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania too. Uh, you had some other people like, for instance, Alfred B. Nkrumah, uh, who went to school at Tuskegee, and actually he became a doctor. He actually did his internship over at the old Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis, which was the black hospital in St. Louis. That's where he did his internship to become a doctor. And so you had a number of Africans who came to the West and got their education. Now, eventually, you also had those who went to England too and who got their education, and so that, and so that became a way for people to increase their knowledge. Now, one of the interesting things, and this is something that Shillington mentions towards the end of this chapter, one of the interesting things that happens is that while Africa is being colonized, people of African descent, people who are descendants of slaves who lived in the United States and who lived in the Caribbean, really took notice of the colonization of Africa. And we see the development of what becomes known as PanAfricanism. And this is the idea that people of African extraction, in particular black people, had a common bond. And that bond was blackness. And this basically resulted from the fact that with the science of that time, black people were seen as distinctly inferior, and so therefore, what people from the Americas, whether it was the Caribbean or the United States, or whether it was Brazil or wherever, they felt this common bond, saying that look, as black people, we need to work together in order to better our situation. And in particular, they wanted to better the situation of people in the African colonies. Now, Shillington mentions a lot of people in the colonies did not know that much about this movement. Now, there were some exceptions. Like, for instance, you had a man who was part Egyptian, part Sudanese, a fellow by the name of Deuce Muhammad, who had connections to Marcus Garvey, who was very interested in African nationalism. You had a few other people like him, but by and large, this was a movement among people in the Americas. Now, however, in the case of those Africans who went to school in the West, like I mentioned before, like Nnamdi Ezekwe of Nigeria, or Kwame Nkrumah, I mentioned earlier, Alfred B. Nkrumah, a number of other people like this, and also some of the French speakers who got involved in the Negritude movement. They had contact with people from the French Caribbean. Eventually the notion of blackness began to go back to Africa, because see, one of the things you have to understand is that Africans didn't see themselves as black people. I mean, obviously they knew their skin was black, but if you were an African, your ethnic background, I mean, if you were in what nowadays is Nigeria, the fact that you might be Yoruba, the fact that you might be Edo, the fact you might be Igbo, the fact that you might be from one of the people from the middle belt of Nigeria. I mean, that was more important. Your religion. I mean, if you were from the north, being a Muslim was more important to you than the color of your skin. However, colonialism made Africans aware that they were seen a certain way because of their skin color. And Pan-Africanism really tended to reinforce that. And so that's the significance of somebody like Marcus Garvey. Because, he was very kind of a flashy, very attention-getting person. And Marcus Garvey's newspapers and his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, really became the first Pan-African movement to really reach deep into Africa and appeal to a lot of people. Although Garvey himself never got to Africa, His ideas got into Africa. Now, you have people like W.B. Du Bois who, uh, African American, one of the first black people. I think he was the first African American to get a PhD in history, and he was a Harvard grad. He was active in Pan-Africanism. He was also active in the NAACP in America, but he did not have the same kind of mass appeal that Garvey did. I mean, Garvey was a guy who had much more of a common touch than Du Bois. I mean, Du Bois was a very educated guy. He didn't necessarily have that kind of common touch. And so the notions of Pan-Africanism really do catch on, and they're going to pick up over time. We're going to see this more in the post-war period. Now, as Shillington mentions at the very end of this chapter, what goes on in Southern Africa with the development of labor union movements and also development of what becomes the ANC, the African National Congress, really, it's kind of shows the ideas that are going to develop in Africa at this time that are going to lead to African nationalism. But like I said, we'll talk about this some more.